Welcome to Va-Dor and our wonderful presentation this afternoon. Thank you all for joining. It is February 21st, and this is a Jews in Fashion. This is a wonderful program for both men and women, and we are grateful, very grateful to Leah Polin, renowned speaker, who will be speaking with us today and showing us some slides. Leah comes from Chicago and moved down to South Florida. She's a graduate of Northwestern University and Roosevelt University. She's been to Israel over 60 times. And the reason is she has 4 children and 14 grandchildren. And of those 14 grandchildren, 11 of them have made aliyah to Israel and live in Israel. And of those 14, 3 are currently serving in the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, which is a very exciting thing. Leah was a teacher by profession. She was an adult educator for over 25 years. And we are very pleased to have her with us today to do this program for Va-Dor. And I thank you all for joining in. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah.
And you can put on the title page. Anyway, thank you, and nice to see all the ladies. There's many names I've given this presentation, from Levi's to Lauren, or a short history of Jews in the fashion industry, or how Jews fashioned the garment industry, but nonetheless, it's one and the same. And indeed, you will find as we go on that Jewish people have been tremendously involved and related to the fashion industry. As you heard, I'm from Chicago, but you will hear later on that at one point in time at the turn of the 20th century, more than 60% of all Jews in New York in some form or fashion. Pardon?
Go on.
No, I was saying that I'm from Chicago, but I'm assuming a lot of you are from New York. And at one point in time, at the turn of the 20th century, more than 60% of all the Jews in the New York area were in some form or fashion connected to the garment industry. Okay, so let's begin with the history of slide 1, Jews in America. So when did Jews come to America? The first group of Jews came, we know, in September of 1654. It was right before Rosh Hashanah. They came on a boat, a small boat called the St. Catherine. There were 23 people on board, including many women and children. And we saw from the manifesto of the ship names like Miriam and Sarah and Leah and Daniela. So we knew that they were women and there were children. Now, how do we know that these people were coming to settle in America as opposed to being traders who went back and forth between the old country and New Amsterdam? And that's because there were women and children on the ship. And the assumption is that they were coming from someplace to land in another place. Does anybody know where this first group of people, Jewish people to America, came from? Any idea?
I have everybody muted except for me, Leah. I'm sorry.
Well, you can either raise your hand or shout it out, but if not, I'll tell you, believe it, because I think you're going to be surprised if you don't know. The first group of people that we're talking about here came from Recife, Brazil. And originally, they had been Sephardim who came and ended up in Brazil from Spain or from Portugal. They were chased out in 1492. Many of them then went to Portugal in 1492, but in 1497, 98, there was another expulsion from Portugal. And they were living very, very, very happily in Recife, Brazil. There was a full Jewish community in Brazil at the time. They had a mohel and a shochet and a rabbi and a Hebrew teacher, and everything was going very well for the Jews there. At that time, it was under the control of the Dutch. And if you know your Jewish history, overall, the Dutch have been reasonably good and favorable to the Jews. So they were having a wonderful life in Recife, Brazil. And then word got out that the Portuguese were about to attack that part of Brazil, and Jewish people knew what it was like to live under the Spaniards or under the Portuguese, and they decide it's time to leave before they chase us out. By the way, it was during that period of time, as an aside, that Jewish people settled so many of the islands in the Caribbean, got involved in the sugar industry. The predecessors to Alexander Hamilton moved to Nevis, and there was a lot of movement from Jewish people to the Caribbean. So since the focus of this talk is not so much history, but clothes, what did colonial people do for clothes? Well, the clothes were very, very, very uncomfortable. They were hot, they were impractical. They tended to be made of cotton or linen or wool, and there was no such a thing yet as a fashion, something that you had to wear. You just wore clothes that you could make yourself, or you can get the material and have someone make it for you. There was nothing like a fashion or trends or anything. And because life was so hard in the colonial times, very little emphasis was given to clothes. It was just something you had to wear to cover your body and had to protect yourself in the cold, or dress appropriately for the warm, for the summer. But really, the fashion industry wasn't even on anybody's horizon. During this period of time, from 1654 through the American Revolution, it's estimated that about 2,800 to 3,000 Jews came to America at that time. And many of them did well. And the bulk of them, as I said, were Sephardi Jews. Next. So now we have, next screen. And now we have, after that, we have what we call several big waves of immigration. The next big wave of immigration came in 1830, and it lasted until 1880. Those are just arbitrary dates, but in 1880 began another wave of immigration where most of us probably came from. But the Jews who came from in the period of time 1830 to 1880 were mainly from Central Europe, Germany, Bavaria, and they were Ashkenazi Jews, very different than the people who were already living here. And they had an element of success already in the cities of Germany before they came here. And so from this group of people, the people who came from about 1830 till about 1880, we have the beginning of shops, the beginning of department stores, and many interesting phenomena in the fashion industry. So I'm going to tell you just about two families. You know them both. We've all benefited from both of them 100%, but they were typical of people who arrived from Central Europe during that period of time. And also, I should say that by the time this 50-year period ended, it was thought that between 250 and 300,000 Jews arrived in America during that period of time. Next. So both families, okay, this is the next, we'll talk about this and then we'll go back. The next big wave is where most of us probably come from, 1880 to 1924. And I would imagine that most of us have our antecedents in this period of time. This is the group that came from Poland and Russia and Belarus and the Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania and all of those Eastern Europe places, the shtetl. They tended to settle in great measure on the Lower East Side of New York, or in neighborhoods, like I said, I'm from Chicago. There was a neighborhood in Chicago called Maxwell Street, which early on had a lot of these people. But I would venture to say that of those of us participating in this program today, the bulk of us have our antecedents or our roots from our grandparents, parents, great-grandparents, who came over from Europe, Eastern Europe, during this period of time. And indeed, it was during this period of time that the fashion industry in America really began to flourish, for good or for bad, and particularly dominated by Jews. So let's see now, next, two families who we're going to focus on, because you know them both, who came in that middle period, 1830 to 1880. And this is the family of Lazarus Strauss. Note that the Strauss has one S at the end. And there was so much written about this, this particular family. But I might say, when I do research on Jewish women or Jewish families, one of the things I look for, no matter what period of time the person comes from, I look at what they contributed to the Jewish community, to their people. Did their children and grandchildren and descendants stay Jewish? Did they only do one great thing for something that we acknowledge them? Or did they do anything more for the Jewish people? So this is the family of a gentleman named Lazarus Strauss, and he came to the United States in 1852 and found himself in a little town called, believe it or not, Talbotton, Georgia. And it wasn't until after his wife arrived in 1854 that in 1865 they moved to New York City. Now, so many things about this family. Number one, they became extremely wealthy in America. But in my research, to this day, 2021, and we're now into the fifth or sixth generation of these people, the three Strauss brothers, every single family member and descendant, no matter how wealthy they are, has married within the Jewish people, which is phenomenal, astonishing, because it is not a fact common in American Jewish history. The three brothers you see, one is Isidore, one is Nathan, and one is Oscar. And their father, Laszlo, was an importer of crock. I'm not exactly sure what crock is, but he began to make a little bit of money from crock. And eventually, these three guys that you see here, these three German brothers, put together a group of little stores, and they were the first ones to come up with a department store, a big store in America called Macy's, and which now is having so many problems, as we know. But the fact that you can go to one store and buy everything, your clothes, your underwear, your household needs, and so on, that is attributable to these three brothers, the three sons of Laszlo Strauss. Now, each of them, they came as immigrants. This is so important. They came as immigrants. And now the oldest brother, Isidore, he became, as an immigrant, a Jewish immigrant from Germany, he became a congressman. And during the Civil War, he worked as an aide to a London Confederate agent. And he was a bond salesman for the Confederates, by the way, in Amsterdam. And he became involved in the Jewish community in terms of being one of the original starters of the American Jewish Committee. And he was one of the founders of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the training institute for conservative rabbis. Now, the next son, Nathan, we'll talk about in a minute. The third brother, Oscar, he became a diplomat and an author and a public servant. He went to Columbia University as an immigrant and became a lawyer. And he was one of the first Jewish people in America to get involved in government. He was our minister of the United States to Turkey way, way back. And then after that, he went on to become so many more things in the foreign industry, foreign government part of our government. All of these people were very, very, very renowned. Now they're children, and they had many children, Jesse and Nathan Jr. and Peter and so on. As I said, to my knowledge, all of them married Jewish people. They married the daughter Sulzberger from the New York Times. They married a Guggenheim. They married a Wahlberg. All the other wealthy people, but they stayed within the Jewish community, and they were all involved. In addition to running a huge business like Macy's, they were all involved in the Jewish community. One thing you'll find interesting, for those of you who like a little bit of gossip, the grandson of one of them, a gentleman named Peter Strauss, he divorced his first wife, who was Ellen Sulzberger, and he married a second woman. Ready for this? Her name was Marcia Lewis, and she was the mother of Monica Lewinsky. So just kind of interesting that Clinton's girlfriend was, her mother was married to the grandson of one of these gentlemen. Now, one I didn't mention so far is Nathan. And Nathan was honored in so many ways, and we all know and we all benefit from some of the things that Nathan did. In those days, at the turn of the 20th century, very wealthy people, like the Strausses, very wealthy people, had their own mansions. And in the backyard of the mansions, they had a piece of land, and they all had their own cow to give their babies, their infants, milk directly from their private cow. Well, Nathan Strauss lost 2 children in infancy, and he was distressed, distraught, he and his wife, and he was determined to get to the root of it. It was Nathan Strauss who had the idea of checking out his cow, and they found that his cow had tuberculosis, and the TB was transferred to his 2 infants, and they died, as I said, in infancy because of the sick cow. Nathan Strauss, at the turn of the 20th century, with his money, then established throughout New York City small milking stations where women can go and get healthy, sterilized, pasteurized milk. He did not come up with the formula, as I said, for sterilization or pasteurization, whatever you want to call it. But it was Nathan who made the connection between milk that wasn't good from a cow and the death of young children. At the end of the 1925, the then mayor of the city of New York ran a contest with all the people in New York. Who was the most distinguished citizen in New York in the first quadrant of the 20th century? And hands down, Nathan Strauss won for that. Now, there's another part of Nathan Strauss's life that all of us know about, probably without realizing that it's attributable to Nathan Strauss. His brother was Oscar, one of the brothers. Oscar was married to Ida, and they decided to plan a trip in the early part of the 20th century to Palestine. They were very involved Jewishly, as I said, and every kind of early Jewish organization. And the 4 people, the 2 brothers and their wives, were going to go to Israel, Palestine, what was Palestine at the time. And at the last minute, Oscar said, you know, Ida and I have worked so hard, we're really tired. We don't want to go with you to Palestine. We're taking a luxury cruise. And Oscar and his wife went on the Titanic, and they died on the Titanic. And there's all sorts of wonderful stories how they, because they were so wealthy and because they were already so well known as such a prominent family, they were offered lifeboats and they were offered special things that other people were not. And they said, no, we are to be treated just like all the other people on the Titanic. And they, tragically, they died on the Titanic. Nathan went ahead to Israel, and in the Palestine, it was called then, and in the early days of Palestine, he established the same milk stations on different corners in Jerusalem where the women could go there and get milk for their children. He was a good friend of a lady named Henrietta Zolt. And it was Nathan Strauss who went to Henrietta Zold and said, all these little outlying medical stations for people to get milk and their health, maybe they should be combined into a hospital. And it was that idea to Henrietta Zold that was the establishment, or led to the establishment, of Hadassah Hospital. He was a great philanthropist, a great human being, honored in America and honored in early days of Palestine. Now, he was ready to come back to America, and a group of people came to him and said, Mr. Strauss, you've done so much for us here in Palestine. We want to name a city after you. Well, he knew what that meant, and he said, that's very nice and very kind, but I don't have any more money to give you. I've given so much money already for this new hospital and for these milking stations and so on. And they said, that's okay. We will do so anyway. And the city in Israel, Netanya, is named after Nathan Strauss. So these men, one family, yes, they're responsible for fashion in terms of bringing fashion into one large building, which was a new concept in America, of course, followed so much by other department stores. And we'll hear in a moment, when there was the westward movement of Jews in America, how many of them established department stores. Now, that's one Strauss family. That's the Strauss family, the children of Laszlo Strauss. Next, another Strauss who we all know. No, next one, where's the, go ahead. No, go back one, maybe Levi Strauss. I'm sorry, keep going forward, keep going forward, keep going forward. Sorry, Levi Strauss. Everybody know Levi Strauss because he is so famous, because I think all of us on this program sometime in our lifetime had a pair of Levi's. His story is amazing, and there's some funny features to it that we will probably think now is really funny. His family also came from Germany, and like many of the people, they were very, very, very poor. Now, Levi Strauss's original name was Loeb, L-O-E-B. Living in America, he thought that was much too Jewish. He had to get an American name. So he changed his name to Levi from Loeb. And if you just think about it, we could all be wearing Loebs instead of Levi's. But anyway, he took on the name Levi Strauss because he thought that didn't sound as Jewish in America at the time. So you can see he was here much of the 19th century. And like many, many, many people, particularly Jewish people, they heard about the gold rush in California. And so many people, many Jewish people, set out aiming to go west, aiming to be the beneficiaries of the gold that was found out there. So he arrived, Levi Strauss never married, by the way. He arrived early on, going all the way west after spending 3 years in Kentucky, trying to make ends meet. And along the way, he arrived in San Francisco, became an American citizen right away. 2 brothers and a sister joined him. They made it all the way to San Francisco. And it wasn't long before his store in San Francisco became a very acknowledged retail store. Supposedly it's the first store, certainly in San Francisco and maybe in America, to have a chandelier and to have an elevator and to be a very, very, very attractive place for people to come and shop. By the time he was in his 30s, he never married, never had any children. His nephews became his business partners and subsequent owners of the Levi Strauss company. But he himself never had any children. And by the time he was in his 30s, he was a very, very successful businessman and very, very, very involved in the political life of San Francisco, as well as the Jewish life in San Francisco. He was one of the early supporters of Temple Emmanuel there. He started the Pacific Hebrew Orphan Asylum. He was on the board of the Hebrew Board of Relief and many, many other Jewish things. Now, the story of Levi's. Levi Strauss did not at all make Levi's. It is a wonderful story, a very, very dramatic story of how Levi's were made. As I said, people were working very, very hard to go across America to get rich. So one man, his name was Jacob Davis, and he was born in Latvia, and he and his wife and 6 children decided to head to California to see if they could become rich with the gold mine. Their money ran out. They were very, very poor, and their money ran out in Reno, Nevada. Now, what they were doing for a living, this Jacob Davis was making blankets for the horses on which the people were riding to go west. He was getting his fabric from his supplier, Levi Strauss in California. And he was, as I say, his job, he was known along the route from the east to the gold country in California as the man who sold blankets for horses to keep the horses, I suppose, warm. The fabric he was getting was from Levi Strauss in San Francisco. And I don't know if it's an anecdote or fact, but the fabric was coming from a town in France called Nimes. And when it got to America, from Nimes, denim, it became denim. I don't know if that's folklore or if that's real history, but that's what I read. So here we have Jacob Davis supporting a wife and 6 poor children in Reno, Nevada, making horse blankets. And one day a woman came in and she said, I have a very fat husband. He keeps going through his pants. And if you can make him a pair of pants that will last 1 year, I will come back next year, I promise you, and give you a commission for $3. Well, $3 to Jacob Davis and his family was big money. So he was going to make this pair of pants. And as he looked over, he saw a box of copper rivets, copper connectors that was sitting there. And he used that box to piece together large pieces of denim for the horse blankets. And he put these copper rivets in the places in this pair of pants for the fat man that he thought the fat man would be stretching and tearing. Well, sure enough, the lady came back a year later, so excited. My husband is still wearing the pants. Here's your $3 commission. Now, his wife said to herself, okay, let's start making those pants. So they began to make the pants as fast as they could, getting all the material from their supplier, Levi Strauss in San Francisco. And one day his wife said to him, let's get a patent on this product before anybody else makes the same thing. They applied to the United States government, and in those days, a patent cost $81. And there was no way that Jacob Davis and his family could come up with $81 for the patent. So his very smart wife said, why don't you write to your supplier in San Francisco? Maybe he'll give us the money and we can make the pants. So he did write to Levi Strauss, and Levi Strauss said, I have a better idea. Why don't you and your family, you and your wife and your 6 kids, travel to San Francisco? We'll go into business together and we'll make the pants together. And so that's what happened. Jacob Davis picked up, they moved to San Francisco. They began to make the pants. There was an enormous demand for the pants, and they had to be able to file them in certain piles. Hence the name 501, which was one of the first numbers given to one of the first piles of Levi's. They became extraordinarily successful. And after a while, Jacob Davis said to Levi Strauss, this is just a fad. It's not going to continue. Nobody's going to want to wear these pants forever. I want out. And so Levi Strauss bought him out. He was out of the business. And the rest, like they say, is history because the Levi Strauss company has gone on to be the initiators in America of things like women wearing pants. Think about that. Women wearing jeans. And they created so many products, coveralls, and the first Dockers. And during the time of World War II, when the soldiers were going abroad and they could bring with very, very little, almost every American soldier brought with him a pair of Levi's. And Levi's became very, 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 very well known around the world. When Levi Strauss died, as I said, he had no children. It was a holiday in San Francisco, and they say that hundreds of people, his employers, and just people who loved him as a nice Jewish man, accompanied the casket, which was in a train going to the next city down in California. So the history of Levi Strauss with probably the product, the singular product that is most connected with fashion, male and female, children and old people in America, was created by Jacob Davis, but we call them Levi's because Levi Strauss and his family made the product. So that is certainly a very major product. All right, back one. I think we, somehow I got it out of order. Back one slide. Okay, next. 4 different people. Some of you heard of, some of them you never heard of, but anyway, very, very, very critical to the fashion industry. Julius Rosenwald. I don't know how many of you saw a documentary on his life about 3 years ago, was shown down here in Florida. Although the focus of the documentary was mainly on the 7,000 schools he paid for Negroes in the South so that they could have better education. But what Julius Rosenwald did, and he was a Chicagoan, I'm proud to say, he was the initiator in our city of 2 incredible things. One was Julius Rosenwald, who was one of the initiators of what we call the Federation, the Jewish Federation. In our city, it's called the JUF, Jewish United Fund. The fact that all Jews should contribute to one fund to help all Jews. That was an idea of Julius Rosenwald. And the other thing Julius Rosenwald did, he left an enormous, enormous, enormous amount of money because he became very wealthy to establish a science museum that we used to call in Chicago. In my growing up days, it was called the Rosenwald Museum. In later years, it became the Museum of Science and Industry, the second greatest science museum in the world. The first one he took his child to see was in Germany, and the child was very, very impressed. And he said, I'm going to go back to America, to my city of Chicago, and to make such a magnificent science museum. So in Chicago, we have the Museum of Science and Industry, originally conceived and funded by Julius Rosenwald. Now, what did he do? There was an enormous thing to the fashion industry. Julius Rosenwald, he created Sears Roebuck, which was a one-stop shop where you could right away, like I suppose like Amazon today, and get your clothes for your children, your husband, and so many things that you need. But what was else so special about that? A person, a lady living in Nebraska, could look in the Sears catalog and say, ah, that fashionable lady in New York is wearing such and so a dress. I want that same dress. So the concept of trends or fads in fashion, where you have to wear what everybody else is wearing that season or that year, was enhanced by the creation of the catalog, where you can look in it and see how other women were dressing or other men were dressing in America. That was a contribution of Julius Rosenwald, and that concept existed for many years. So if you think the department store was a Jewish creation, the catalog was a Jewish creation, and nowadays things are different, I suppose, with places like Amazon and so on. The next story, I know you've never heard of this gentleman, but the story, if you can read the label, is so amazing. Rabbi Moses Phillips. He was one of those men with his wife and 8 children. He was an Orthodox rabbi, very poor, and they were heading west also to take advantage and become rich with the development of the gold in California. Their money ran out in Western Pennsylvania, Pottsburg or Pottsfield, something in Western Pennsylvania. And his wife was making collarless shirts, flannel shirts, sewing them as fast as she could sew. And he was taking them on his push cart and going down the roads where the people were traveling to head west and selling his collarless flannel shirts that his wife Ethel was making. And he was barely making a living for his wife and 8 children. One day, he met another peddler on the road, and he said, "What do you have there?" And he said, "I'm selling collarless shirts." And the guy said to him, "Oh, that's nice. Maybe we can go into business together. Maybe we can do something with the shirts." So he went home to his wife, and his wife put on a collar on the collarless shirt. And it became, like we see, the men's shirt that we know today. The man's name was John Van Heusen, and John Van Heusen and Rabbi Moses Phillips became partners in making these shirts. And it wasn't long before it became very, very, very successful. And the 2 men, John Van Heusen and Rabbi Moses Phillips, opened up a place in New York. They were also the first fashion empire, shall we say, the fashion to advertise in magazines and newspapers. Well, John Van Heusen bought out Rabbi Moses Phillips. So the good and the bad. The tragedy of the story is, and I heard this from a gentleman down here in Florida who retired a few years ago, was a vice president of Van Heusen. Moses Phillips started the company. He had 8 children. Not one child remained Jewish, married Jewish people, and nobody is in the business. It's completely in the hands of, well, it was a Van Heusen. Now I imagine there's stockbrokers and so on. But Van Heusen is the largest maker today of men's shirts, ties, and clothes. They also buy the labels of famous designers. So if you go to buy a shirt by Calvin Klein or Bill Blass, I don't know, chances are it is manufactured by the Van Heusen company. And Van Heusen also manufactures most of the ties in the world, from a $2 tie you would buy on the street corner of New York when the weather was right, before Corona, or to a $300 tie you could buy at Neiman Marcus. They are all being manufactured by Van Heusen. But that part of the men's fashion industry was started by Rabbi Moses Phillips from Western Pennsylvania. Now, the lady on the lower left, Ida Cohn Rosenthal, a fabulous and incredible story. She was born in Russia. Her name in Russia before it became Ida was Idel. And several years ago, I don't know if you know, several years ago, maybe 5 years ago or so, there was a wonderful book written called The Family by an author named David Rask. I forget his last name now. It was called The Family. And in his book, he talked about his cousin Ittel, who at 13, 14, 15, 16 as a teenager would be the only one to go out and fight against the Cossacks. This Ittel was just fearless. Well, Ittel ended up coming to America, and Ittel, from the book The Family by David Laskin, just hit me, David Laskin, a great book to read, Laskin. Ittel became Ida. She came to New Jersey with a sewing machine, and she opened up a shop in New Jersey. The shop became successful, and she had a partner, Enid, and they moved the shop to New York, and it was called Enid's something, or Fashion Frocks, Enid's Frocks. And it was the time of the 20s, and the dresses at the time were very flat, and they flared out at the bottom. So women would come into the store and say, "I love that dress," or so on. But why do I have to have such a flat shape? We have to do something so I don't look like have a male form. I want to have a maiden form. And it was Ida Cohn Rosenthal and her husband, William Rosenthal, who came up with the idea of the bra. And Maidenform Bra became their company. And as Ida Cohn Rosenthal, was developing the company, her husband, kind of cute, her husband, William, was giving the names and the numbers to bras, like 32, 34, 36, 38, you know, A, B, C, D. And Ida Cohn Rosenthal, was marketing the Maidenform bras, which of course became super, super, super successful. Then, by the way, they had one child and he died, a very sad personal life. But then Ida Cohn Rosenthal did something else, which if you have any children or grandchildren who have degrees or master's degrees in marketing, they would know. Ida Cohn Rosenthal was the first one to advertise, shall we say, underwear or intimate apparel on magazines, newspapers, but she developed one slogan that was used for 20 years. I dreamt I was a somebody in my Maidenform bra, or I dreamt I was on a mountaintop in my Maidenform bra. I dreamt I was in a chariot with my Maidenform bra. And that advertising slogan became so successful. It existed for 20 years. The same thing, I dreamt I was something, that it's taught in graduate schools for marketing as one of the most successful marketing campaigns of any product. So she is responsible for women's underwear and of course changing the whole world of advertising for women's fashion. The next lady we all know, Estee Lauder, but Estee Lauder did something amazing for the fashion industry. By the way, now Estee Lauder is such a successful businesswoman. Well, she's died now. She was in the 20th century, that her company, Estee Lauder, would buy up the competition. So if you wear Clinique or Dr. Brown or Prescriptives or MAC or I don't know what, as soon as another company came on the horizon and became successful, the Estee Lauder company would buy it up. But it was Estee Lauder who made it, I don't want to say mandatory, but who made it de rigueur for women to wear makeup. Prior to that time, really only two classes of women wore makeup, either royalty or shall we say women of the street. Normal people didn't wear makeup. And Estee Lauder made it so that the wearing of makeup was mandatory for women. And of course, she developed a very, 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 very major empire. At the end of the last century, the business editor of Time magazine interviewed the most successful business people of the 20th century. They were all men, except for Estee Lauder. She was considered singularly the most successful businesswoman of the 20th century. And the reporter asked her, you know, you were so involved in your business. Did you do anything else for your people or for humanity? And she got somewhat indignant and she said, I did the greatest thing for the Jewish people. I gave them my son. Her son is Ron Lauder, still alive. She had two sons, Leonard and Ron. Leonard ran the business. Ron went into the field of philanthropy, Jewish philanthropy, and it was her son, Ron Lauder, who was responsible, not quite single-handedly, but for the revitalization of Poland and Eastern Europe after the Holocaust. The new museums, the new yeshivas, the new schools, the fact of bringing kids over from Israel and working, all of that was funded, is funded, still funded by Ron Lauder and the Lauder Foundation. And then a few years ago, you may have seen his name in the paper because it was a very famous painting. There was even a movie about it, The Woman in Gold, that had been painted by a Jewish artist and had always been in Jewish hands. And now it was on the market and it was going to be sold to a Gentile. And Ron Lauder came along and for a mere $135 million, he bought the painting so that it would continue to stay in the hands of Jewish people. So Estee Lauder, where she herself was a ferocious, competitive, nonstop working woman and created an empire, her son has been, and to this day is, very, very, very involved in the Jewish community. All right, next, a whole bunch of other people and different ways that they've contributed to fashion. This, I think, is what you want to see, different names of people that you would recognize today in the fashion industry. So the gentleman on the left, I don't know how well you can see him, but he is polishing a pair of red shoes. And those red shoes, does anybody know who wore those red shoes? They were worn by Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. And this gentleman, Adrian Greenberg, was his real name. He changed it to Adrian. Adrian became the most successful and the first of many people who were the designers for the Hollywood movie stars. Very, 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 very successful. And it began until this day, the costume designers in Hollywood who make the clothes when we go to the movies, when we did go to the movies, and we just longed to wear, Adrian Greenberg was the first such person. Then at the period of time after World War II, a whole bunch of people began to come from Europe and change their names. So for example, a woman came from Austria. Her name was Henrietta Kannengeiser. She wanted to become American. She changed her name to Hattie Carnegie. Sally Milgram became one of the designers of Eleanor Roosevelt. And we have a slew of women who went on to become very popular designers for important people in America. Molly Parnas, a wonderful story. She was married to a man named Leon Levinson, changed his name to Livingstone to be American. It was 1933. That's what people did at the time. And he saw that his wife, Molly, had an eye for design, and she became a designer. And she was asked in 1955 by Mamie Eisenhower if she could design the dress that Mamie Eisenhower would wear to her inauguration. And she did. It was a shirtwaist dress with green and blue taffeta. And as Mamie Eisenhower walked into the inauguration, another woman was there with the very same dress. So that really cut short Molly Parnas's career. The next woman, Anne Klein, only lived to age 50. And her real name, by the way, was Hannah Golovsky from Brooklyn. Anne Klein is a woman that, without a doubt, every woman watching this program and all of your children and grandchildren are indebted to her. Why? Up until Anne Klein, the fashion was the main fashion designer in the world. Everybody looked to Coco Chanel, and Coco Chanel's designs were that you had to match at the top and the bottom. The jacket and the skirt had to match. Anne Klein did two things. Anne Klein was a petite woman. She did not fit exactly into sizes 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So Anne Klein came up with junior sizes, junior sophisticates, 5, 7, 9, 11, for the woman who wasn't exactly built the way that it was thought that she would be built. And then Anne Klein did something for which we were all very, very grateful. She said, why does everybody have to dress with the top and the bottom matching? Why can't we wear separates? Why can't we go and pick a skirt we like here with a jacket we like here? Why can't we get a pair of pants that we like here and wear it with a jacket that we like there? And that is a concept that stays with us till this day. And I don't have any doubt, 100%, that all of us women dress like that, with what we like on the top and the bottom, and that's because of Anne Klein. She died at 50 years old of breast cancer, but her imprint is certainly deep in the fashion industry. Judith Lieber, I think you can see this, an incredible story, a high-priced purse. Her purses start, at least they did a few years ago, at about $7,000. I don't know what they are now, but Judith Lieber was born in and raised in Hungary. You know that Hungary didn't get involved in the war, the Jews, until the very end. She thought she had escaped, but in the end, her family was involved too, and she suffered, and then the war was over, and she was walking down the streets of Hungary, Budapest, and she met an American GI named Mr. Gerson, who himself was an artist, and they got married and came to America. And it was her husband who encouraged her to go into using gems, jewels, baubles, beads, all sorts of fine stones into making purses. Her purses are worn by the celebrities, the movie stars, the important people of the world. They're usually sold under lock and key at most department stores because they start at $7,000. And just a fascinating tidbit I think we'd all find very emotional. Over the last many inaugurations in America, the First Lady, the incoming First Lady, carries a Judith Lieber purse, and the President-elect wears a suit custom designed by Martin Greenfield, who was an Auschwitz survivor, came to America and went to work for a company named 3Gs, sweeping the floors, watched how the tailors did their cutting and their sewing, bought the company. He knew Eisenhower because Eisenhower stopped by when Greenfield's group of people were coming out of Auschwitz, and Eisenhower was walking through, and at that meeting he met Elie Wiesel, and he met Martin Greenfield. And Martin Greenfield stopped and asked Eisenhower and the Rabbi Herschel Schafter, where was God during the war? And Eisenhower remembered that. And many years later, when Eisenhower was inaugurated, his suit was made by Martin Greenfield, who had already become an American success. So many more people in the fashion industry will go through very quickly. Ralph Lauren, everybody knows Ralph Lauren. His real name was Ralph Lifshutz. His father was a house painter, but a very frustrated artist. And Ralph Lauren's contribution to the world of fashion is twofold and very great. Ralph Lauren claims that everything he designed has his imprint on it in terms of quality as well as design. And something by Ralph Lauren implies good quality. He was always impressed as a teenager by the British and royalty, and hence his clothes have logos with the words like polo or champion on them. But he became very successful very early on. One of the first things Ralph Lauren did, his clothes were very expensive and they weren't available to everybody because not everybody had thousands of dollars to spend for a dress. But Ralph Lauren came up with the idea of a middle line, a bridge line, so that when I was shopping in Chicago, I love his clothes because they last forever. I would go to Macy's or Lord & Taylor and buy Ralph Lauren clothes. Maybe they were in the hundreds of dollars, but I felt that they had quality and design, just like the clothes that were selling for $2,000 and $3,000. So the first thing Ralph Lauren did was to make a bridge line so that those of us who are in middle class America could afford quality clothes just like rich people. But the second concept that Ralph Lauren introduced, which is unbelievable because we take it so for granted, but he introduced it. If my name is good on clothes, if it means something on a men's shirt or on a lady's dress, it should be good on anything. And Ralph Lauren introduced the concept of branding, putting his name on wallpaper, putting his name on bed linens, putting his name on kitchen dishes, anything, paint, anything that had the Ralph Lauren name, we would think it had quality, it has his imprimatur on it. And so the whole concept that we take for granted now of branding, having a person's name on so many different products, that was instituted by Ralph Lauren. He is singularly still alive in his low 80s. He is singularly one of the most successful, he's a billionaire, one of the most successful people in the fashion industry. Diane von Furstenberg, very, very, very interesting story. She is responsible for one major thing in fashion. She was coming on the horizon when women were going back to work. And she said to herself, wow, if a woman goes to work in the morning and then has a date in the evening and she doesn't have time to go home and change her clothes, what could she do? So Diane van Furstenberg came up with the concept of the wrap dress that you can wear to work in the morning and you can change the jewelry or change the scarf or change the shoes or the boots, and the same dress can carry you through from something very, very casual to something very, very special. And I would imagine that all of us at one point in our lives had wrap dresses because everybody had a wrap dress. One interesting story, her mother was a survivor of Auschwitz and the death march, and told her story about how for 4.5 years she could never get warm, how horrible it was, life in the concentration camps and the forced marches and so on. And when her mother got her reparations from Germany, she went out and spent it all on a custom designed sable coat. And she said to Diane, she said, I never want to be cold again. And that's what I want to do with my money. Okay, next, Isaac Mizrahi. He has become quite popular. You've seen him on TV. He's very popular on talk shows and so on. His background is kind of interesting. He was the only child of a Sephardic family. His parents are Zeke and Sarah Mizrahi, and they grew up in that very tight-knit, close Syrian Jewish community in New Jersey, Deal, New Jersey. And his father worked in the garment industry as a cutter. And very early on, his mother took him to the ballet and to shopping expeditions. And he got very, very interested in clothes. And he became a designer, a very popular designer. But then a few years ago, he also did something very, very, very interesting in the fashion industry. He felt that not everybody, you shouldn't have to be rich to wear beautiful clothes. And Isaac Mizrahi signed a long-term contract with Target that his clothes for women, for children, for men, his housewares, because he learned the branding concept from Ralph Lauren, would be sold at Target. So that's the story of Isaac Mizrahi, very popular, who left his career at the pinnacle and sold the concept to Target. The next person, Zach Posen, I suspect many of you never heard of Zach Posen, but if you ask your daughters or granddaughters, every single one of them knows Zach Posen because he is the designer of the hour, and he is the designer for the people on the runways for the movies, for the Hollywood, the Oscars, the Golden Globes. He is the fashion designer of the hour for Beyonce and Rihanna and all those people I don't even know. But very, very, very successful. A young Jewish guy from Brooklyn, and he claims that his grandpa would take him to shul and he would bring home yarmulkes, kippot, and cut them up and make little dresses. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway, Zach Posen, who's a much younger guy, is the designer of the hour in America. Maybe for not for an older generation, but for younger people. Next. Anyway, here we have a list of names of companies that are owned by Jewish people. Marc Jacobs, Victoria's Secret, and the whole complex of that whole empire is a Wexner empire. DKNY, The Gap, The Limited, Columbia, and Timberland were recently bought by the Schwartz family, Vidal Sassoon, and Calvin Klein, of course. Jewish people have been involved in the fashion industry tremendously since coming to America. You have names like Eli Tahari, Leah Gottlieb, who designs all the bathing suits, the Wertheimer family, who owns Chanel perfumes, Vidal Sassoon and the hair products, Sidney Kimmel, who owns Jones and Nine West, Kenneth Lang Jewelry, David Yurman Jewelry, Calvin Klein, Donna Klein, Michael Kors, so many people. And then you have the retail stores, some of which are unfortunately struggling now, but The Gap, The Limited, Timberland, Banana Republic, Victoria's Secret, Eddie Bauer, all of those are owned by Jewish people. And of course, you need the labor people to keep the people happy. You have people who started the labor unions, like Sidney Hillman, Bessie Abramowitz, they married together, David Dubinsky, Rose Schneiderman, and so many others. Every aspect, oh, and of course there's Frida Lohman. Somebody said, how could you not mention Frida Lohman? So many of us grew up shopping for bargains at Lohman. So since their arrival in America at the turn of the 20th century and a little bit before, Jewish people have been very, very, very involved in the fashion industry, not only as consumers like many of us have, but as designers, as owners, as lawyers, in every which fashion. And a nice quote to end with by Kenneth Cole, the shoe designer, what you stand for as a person is more important than what you stand in, meaning his shoes. So this is just a brief overview of some of the Jewish people who have contributed to the fashion industry in America in recent years. So I thank you. I think that's the last one, right? The last slide?
Is. So I am going to allow people to unmute themselves. And I'm going to put it in gallery mode so we can see everybody. If you want to say something, please raise your hand. Leah, I'd like to say, first of all, that was a wonderful presentation. I thank you for doing this for Congregation Va-Dor, our members and guests and friends. And I am just thrilled that you did this for us. And it was a lot of information, and it was very interesting. So thank you. Who would like to say something? Please mute yourself unless you have your hand raised. Okay, go ahead, Suzanne.
I just wanted to say thank you very much. Beautiful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
It was. Who else has their hand raised? Okay, go ahead, Valerie.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was really fascinating. And, when you reflect on the times, how in the beginning of the 20th century, how so many Jews who came over from Europe and all other parts of the world felt compelled to change their name. And it's amazing to me how many people even now are Jewish, and some of the younger people don't even realize that their roots are in the Jewish religion, because they have no association with the Jewish religion whatsoever. It really is quite amazing.
It's interesting because one of the quotes, when I sometimes do this, at the turn of the century, when the immigrants were coming, and they were coming from Europe, and the men were wearing heavy, rough fabric jackets and ugly clothes. And one of the immigrants, a quote I have from one of the immigrants, I can put my finger on it immediately. Here, this is just amazing, talking about changing images. So this, and I quote, "I was forever watching and striving to imitate the dress and the ways of the well-bred American merchants," said one man who had just arrived, wearing his coarse pants and rough textured shirts. A whole book could be written on the influence of what one starch collar and a necktie on a man who was brought up like me, what it would mean. So by the changing of their clothes when they came to America, not just their name, they wanted to get rid of that shtetl image, and they want to, they realized what clothes meant to them. Yes.
Right.
Rosalie,
it's-
go ahead. Unmute yourself, Rosalie. Click on the microphone, unmute.
Right, okay. Thank you, that was great. And my husband's was in the shoe business all of our married life, and so was his family. So this was very similar to us to hear all this, and they too were all Jewish. Thank you very much. We liked
I
the
could-
presentation.
Yeah, I couldn't wait. I've never given this talk where hands don't come up and say, my father did this, or my uncle owned a glove company, or my father owned such and so shirts. I was waiting for somebody to
Yeah,
say
here we
that
are.
their family
Almost
was,
got it in New England.
yeah, everybody.
And then we went overseas and finished it the last 10 years.
Uh-huh. If any of you are interested, a book came out 3 years ago, not long ago, 3 years ago, from a writer down here that was on most people's book club. It was called, is called The Button Man.
Oh, we read it.
Did you
We-
read The Button Man?
Yes,
Okay,
we all did. Yes.
because that is a great book, a true story about this man's family's business in the Leslie Fay Dress Company, and how it was started by an immigrant, grown by people. The lawyers then came in, and then tragically, the bad guys came in, and then a brilliant book about how something evolved in the fashion
Yeah,
industry.
we read that. It was great. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to ask anything? Go ahead, Valerie.
I was just going to say that my grandfather, who came over in 1902 to escape the pogroms, he started Charles Keller Inc., which was fashion umbrellas in New York City, manufactured in the United States, and signed contracts with all of the major concerns and manufactured umbrellas to match their clothing. He had mink-lined umbrellas with coral handles. It was amazing. And my father, years later, took over the company, AAA Umbrellas in New York. And so they manufactured in conjunction with a lot of the fashion houses. So yeah.
Interesting.
Wow,
So they
very
had-
interesting.
The fabric
Wow.
from the umbrella matched the people's wardrobes? Is that what
They
you're
would
saying?
they would coordinate the fashions, yes, and all of the umbrellas. And they eventually went into screen printing for carry-alls and bags with the logos of the big manufacturing companies. And they would put it on the umbrellas.
Wow.
Very
Wendy,
interesting.
go
Thank
ahead.
you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed it. I'm here with my friend Rose, who you can see, and that's why we're masked. You all met her yesterday at Bryant Park, but it was a wonderful presentation. I was taking notes so I can share a lot of it with my sister. Rose was wondering if you had anything to tell us about Neiman Marcus, though I'm sure there were tons of people you didn't have time to mention.
Oh, well, it was started by a Dallas family. One of the programs I do, I'd love to do it for you, because it's 10 Jewish families who built America. And I talk about 10 cities, Indianapolis, Dallas, San Francisco, New York, and so on, where a Jewish family did something very significant. And in Dallas, it wasn't Neiman Marcus, it was the Sangers who followed the railroad that was heading into Dallas. And they opened up stores along the way, and eventually opened up huge department stores in the Dallas area. And one day, Edna Ferber, the writer, was going through there, and she was impressed with this big store, and she mentioned it, and that sort of put them on the map. And they went on to become very wealthy family throughout the state of Texas. So that's a program, how one family, by doing one thing in a city, whatever that city was, helped make that city a very great growing city. But when I was doing with Dallas, it wasn't Neiman Marcus, although that's where they're from. It was another Jewish family, of course, named Sanger, who put Dallas on the market for department stores.
It's very interesting how many of these people that you were mentioning
What, we lost the
I
rest.
think we lost her internet. She lost her internet. Sorry. I'm going to go over to Judith. Go ahead, Judith.
Something you mentioned struck me that the Estee Lauder, that before her, most women were not wearing makeup. Well, my parents were originally from Vienna. They were in medical school when Hitler came in. They had to escape. The rest of the relatives died. But my dad got into the States. My mom got into England, and they wrote for 7 years. So I have all their letters. And their letters, my dad kept saying, you better not be wearing lipstick or painting your nails, because it was considered, slutty to do that or whatever. And I thought, what the heck? But
Yeah.
that was true then. So
And it took one woman to make it de rigueur for all the other billions of women in the world. We have to have our makeup because somebody told us that's the way we should dress. Yes.
Wow. Go ahead, Wendy. Try it now.
I put my phone back on, so you should be able to hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I found it interesting that so many of these families started out in the South, because we think of Jews now being concentrated in the Northeast or the South, Southwest, California, that kind of thing. And it was interesting that families that were in Georgia or Kentucky, it just was strange to me. How was it that is there a reason so many of them started out down south?
Well, among other things in this.
Wait. Wendy, can't have both.
Among other things in the South, it was Jewish families who made money and made the uniforms for the Confederacy. It was Jewish families in the South, although this was true almost all over America, but it was Jewish families in the South that started department stores, small department stores in all the big southern cities when you would travel years ago through the South. A big company that I think just is no longer, Steinmart. The family is from nowhere, Mississippi. Forget the name of the town, absolutely nowhere, Mississippi. I don't know the reason, but Southerners were never given their due, I think, because of the Civil War. But Jewish families were very, very instrumental in the South. We lived for 2 years of our married life in Portsmouth, Virginia. And the big stores there were Hochheimer Shoes and Tallheimers and forgot the name of the department store, just all owned by Jewish people, German Jews from early on, from that wave I spoke about, or European Jews afterwards. And in some cases, they're still there. In many cases, the kids moved up for higher education and they're now professionals. But Jews were always in that kind of business. I don't know if it makes any. My husband's family, his mother's family, at the turn of the 20th century, when they came from Europe, his grandpa was a 25-year-old rabbi, and they sent the family up to Copper Country, Upper Peninsula in Michigan. They didn't know a thing about copper mining in Michigan. They were an Orthodox family, and they were stuck and sent by Hayes and the government in to a town called South Range near Houghton and Hancock in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And his grandfather died, and his grandmother at 25 started a store up there. And she would get her supplies from a Jewish man who would come by once every so often and leave his supplies with her in this very cold climate in northern Michigan. Well, fast forward many years later, the descendants of that woman settled in Chicago. My husband's brother became a rabbi, and he was in yeshiva talking to some boys. It was their grandfather who supplied his grandmother all her things in South Range, Michigan. They both ended up being Orthodox families and somehow found themselves up in Copper Country, Michigan. Those kinds of stories exist all over America. And a lot of it is because when the Jewish people came, they were at the mercy of where they were sent, or if they didn't have relatives in New York, they had to go to these places like Houghton, Hancock, Michigan, or Utica, Mississippi, and that's how they got there.
Well,
You need a good course in Jewish American history. Go through all that. It's fascinating.
Well, Leah, I thought that this presentation was one of the best we've had. I thank you so much. The stories were amazing. The tidbits that you gave, I had no idea about a lot of this. I believe I have some fashion tailors a lot in my family, and this was extremely intriguing. I thank you for all the time that you took to present it and to put it together for us. And I'm just applaud you for
Thank
this
you.
wonderful afternoon. And I thank you very much for doing this. And I thank everyone for their attendance. And we have lots of beautiful comments to you, Leah, that people enjoyed it immensely. And they had to leave, but they just thought it was wonderful. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
And have a great afternoon. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Okay, thank you.